Good evening, good evening, good evening. It's so good to welcome you all back to SF Jazz. Please give yourselves a round of applause for leaving the house. My name is Nick Breisowitz, and I'm the Director of Strategy here at the Long Now Foundation. And every November, I jump on stage for a minute just to remind the world that the Long Now Foundation is a nonprofit organization. And specifically, we're a nonprofit that relies on the support of members and friends like all of you to continue our work from year to year. I always jump on stage in November because it's the beginning of what we call giving season. And we actually raise a formidable fraction of our general operating budget every year in the last 8 weeks of the calendar year before. And so it's an important time of year for us. And this particular year is especially important for us because it's our 25th anniversary year. Thank you. And as we're taking time to reflect on all of the things that we've been able to accomplish and set in motion in that first quarter century, we're also taking a lot of time to think about this next quarter century, the next 25 years between now and 2046. And we're thinking about what the world needs from the Long Now Foundation and where the world needs more long-term thinking in this next 25 years. So that's a conversation, and it's a conversation that's opening up, and it's keeping me really energized and excited about this. And I want to invite all of you to continue that conversation tonight after this event. We're going to be gathering together at Beer Garden, which is just 1 block away. It's an outdoor venue that they're going to keep the kitchen open for us. They're going to serve drinks late for us. It's just at Fell in Octavia. So if you don't have plans afterwards and you don't need to get back into your house, please come join us for a conversation about so much that we can do around long-term thinking. Thank you so much, and enjoy the show tonight.
I can tell you, it has been a long 22 months. Welcome. I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director here at Long Now, and now I have a beard. I look like this. It's been, like I said, a long 22 months. I'm so glad that this is a talk that we really get to come back with. And Neal Stephenson has been a very long time fellow traveler with Long Now. And I was reading his books even before I started with Long Now 25 years ago. And they're always some of the most evocative ways to look at the future. And then as we got to know him and work with him on some projects, we'll talk about that a little bit later. He actually submitted some of the first clock ideas on this project. And he has this kind of amazing prophetic ability to take a piece of technology and then push it into the future and see the way that's going to affect society. And in some cases, a little bit too prophetic, I think, and kind of dangerously so. But tonight, in lieu of trying to ruin this book for you, we're actually going to talk about one of those types of technologies that is in part of this next book. We're actually going to kind of take a look at it from a scientific point of view that I think is going to be an interesting lesson, the way we look at thousands of years in the past and thousands of years in the future, especially around climate change. So welcome, Neal Stephenson.
Normally, when I do a reading, I read from my own book for obvious reasons. But this time I'm going to try something different. I'm going to quote from some fascinating books written by other people. And as I do, I'm going to flash the covers up on the screen to give due credit to the authors and so that you can follow up if you want to read more on your own. In 536 AD, the Byzantine historian Procopius was in Italy describing a year without a summer. During the whole year, the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon, and it seemed extremely like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it emitted were not clear like those it usually makes. John of Ephesus reported similar phenomena in the eastern part of the empire. The sun darkened and stayed covered with darkness a year and a half. Although rays were visible around it for 2 or 3 hours a day, they were as if diseased, with the result that fruits did not reach full ripeness. All the wine had the taste of reject grapes. John Lytus, a Byzantine official, posited a physics-based explanation for the anomaly. The sun becomes dim because the air is dense from rising moisture, as happened in the course of the recently passed 14th indiction, which is to say 535 and 536, for nearly a whole year. Cassiodorus at the same time wrote, "How strange it is, I ask you, to see the sun, but not its usual brightness, to gaze on the moon, glory of the night at its full, but shorn of its natural splendor. We are all still observing a sun as blue as the sea. We marvel at bodies that cast no shadow at midday, and at the force of strongest heat reduced all the way to the impotence of extreme mildness." And this is not the brief absence of an eclipse, but as one that has taken place for nothing short of almost the whole year. We have had a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. There was no way that these writers could have known it, but the events they were describing were triggered by 2 or 3 massive volcanic eruptions elsewhere in the world that all happened to occur in a span of a few years, beginning around 536. One might have been in Iceland, another somewhere in the tropics, and one was definitely at Ilopango in what's now El Salvador. Ilopango alone produced 87 cubic kilometers of ejecta and had devastating effects on the Mayans. At the same time, up in Scandinavia, a culture was dying out. This was a precursor culture to what we later called the Vikings. Historians have debated why this culture waned and disappeared, and there were probably a number of reasons, but it couldn't have helped that in a part of the world that was already famous for cold weather and marginal agriculture, they got hit with a series of incredibly cold winters. No direct accounts survive, but the Nordic cultures that arose afterwards may have preserved some cultural memory of the event in their stories. For them, the end of the world would come not in fire, but in ice, a terrible winter called the Thimble Winter, or the mighty winter. So here's a passage from the Edda. "First of all, that a winter will come called Thimble Winter. Then snow will drift from all directions. There will then be great frosts and keen winds. The sun will do no good. There will be 3 of these winters together and no summer between." Another Eddic poem, the Seeress's Prophecy, states, "Black become the sun's beams in the summers that follow. Weather's all treacherous. The sun starts to blacken. As the sun vanishes, the stars fall into the sea, where their heat raises a great steam that covers the sky." The Finnish Kalevala contains the following: "What wonder blocks out the moon? What fog is in the sun's way, that the moon gleams not at all and the sun shines not at all?" Parenthetically, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out what's probably obvious to all of you, which is that these legends of anomalous long winters that change the course of human destiny are, of course, fundamental to George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones. Doom by Neil Ferguson catalogs several post-volcanic winters. An eruption in Peru in 1600 was followed by severe winters in Scandinavia and a famine in Russia. A 1640 eruption in Japan led not only to cold summers and failed harvests in its vicinity, but droughts in Greece, Egypt, India, and other places. After the 1783 eruption of Laki, a volcano in Iceland, Benjamin Franklin wrote of a constant fog over Europe and parts of North America. The Mississippi froze at New Orleans, and the resulting food shortages, some historians believe, helped touch off the French Revolution. 1816 was called the year without a summer because of the eruption of Tambora in Indonesia. It and the earlier Laki eruption in Iceland are basically tied for the modern record. Each put about 110 million tons of sulfates into the air. The Long Now Foundation owns property that's home to a number of ancient bristlecone pine trees. Researchers have been able to sample these and use tree ring analysis to see how the growth rate varied from year to year as a result of changes in weather. Sometimes the effects are obvious enough that anyone can just see them by looking at a slice of the wood, but there are also special staining techniques that can make the changes more obvious. 2036 BCE was apparently marked by a large volcanic eruption that left a clear discontinuity in the sample on the left. The sample on the right shows a couple of anomalous years around 1419 BCE. You can identify them from the blue fringes in the staining. Here's a plot of tree ring data. What's being plotted here is the thickness of the rings, which gives you an idea of growing conditions year by year. A higher value suggests a better growing season. A low value suggests that the weather was bad. I've superimposed some vertical red lines showing the dates of some of the big eruptions mentioned in Neil Fergus's book. Some of the big drops are observable in years following some of the big eruptions, notably Lombok, Indonesia, which is the leftmost one, and the one in Peru, which is here. But in other cases like Laki, there's not much of a change. This is kind of interesting in that you don't always see a strong one-to-one correlation between these eruptions, these volcanic events, and weather in a particular part of the world. There's a global effect, but those effects are distributed just because of the complexity of atmospheric physics. Here's a similar chart done better. In the lower part of the chart, you're seeing two plots, a bunch of spikes drawn in black, which are telling you the amount of volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere. So for example, there's a super high spike right here in the late 1200s. This group here is probably Tambora around 1816. This one here is probably Laki, and so on and so forth. So then the blue line is showing how much the temperature is thought to have deviated from average. And again, the correlations aren't always perfectly one for one. We see a big drop after Tambora down here, but there's other cases where nothing seems to happen. So at the other end of the 19th century, Edvard Munch painted this famous masterpiece. The dramatic red sky in the background is open to interpretation, of course, but the painting was made not long after the eruption of Krakatoa, which depressed temperatures all over the world and created spectacular sunsets like this one for a couple of years afterwards. In the 1960s, yet another eruption in Indonesia put a plume of ejecta into the atmosphere. The Australians got a plane in the air to take samples. When it landed, they noticed a deposit on the windscreen. One of the Australian scientists licked it and reported that it was painfully acid. A more sophisticated analysis found that it was sulfates, sulfuric acid, basically. In 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, it was possible to gather a lot more scientific data beyond the now familiar empirical sensations of depressed global temperatures and brilliant sunsets. This is all quite well understood. When sulfur dioxide is injected into the stratosphere, it combines with available water to form sulfuric acid, which drifts around in the form of a very large number of tiny droplets. When such a droplet is struck by light from the sun, some of the light will bounce back into space. So it never reaches the troposphere, which is where weather happens, and it can't warm up the planet. Some of the light will be deflected sideways. This contributes to a general brightening of the sky that explains the beautiful sunsets, as well as some of the mysterious atmospheric phenomena described by those Byzantine and Scandinavian sources, as well as Benjamin Franklin himself. And some of the light keeps going down and continues to warm the Earth as usual. This keeps happening for a couple of years, which is how long it takes for the sulfates to wash out of the atmosphere. Then everything goes back to normal. Sulfates have remarkable leverage against global temperatures. The amount of sulfates needed to cool down the Earth by 1 or 2 degrees simply isn't that large. It's easy to imagine engineered delivery systems that would duplicate what volcanoes have done many times in the past. High-altitude tanker planes, high-altitude balloons, and big guns have all been mentioned. This kind of thing goes under the name solar geoengineering. It's a perfectly well-known concept among scientists who study these things, but it doesn't get talked about much because it's controversial. Unfortunately, the CO2 level in the atmosphere keeps on rising regardless. This is a screen grab from just a few days ago showing that the current level is about 414 parts per million. That's up from 411 in the last year. The graph on the lower right just happens to begin around the time I was born. And it shows that just during my lifetime, it's gone from below 320 parts per million to almost 420. And if you look at the shape of that curve, not only is it going up, which means that the problem is getting worse, but it's got a little upward curve to it, indicating that the pace at which it's getting worse is accelerating. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, this number was in the mid 200s. Today, it's the highest it has been since a few million years ago, when the world had a completely different climate. Various governments have announced plans to cut back on carbon dioxide emissions. China, for example, is saying that by 2030, their emissions will level off. In other words, if they do that and every other country in the world does likewise, the CO2 level will, at that point, become a mere linear function of time. It'll still be going up at an impressive rate, but the rate itself won't be increasing. This plot will no longer have that slight upward curve. It'll just be a straight ramp angling upwards. By something like 2060 or 2070, it's hoped that the world economy might reach net zero carbon emissions. This doesn't solve the problem. It'll turn this curve into a flat horizontal line. If the CO2 level in the atmosphere is, say, 500 parts per million in 2070, it'll remain at 500 until natural processes can bring it back down again, which is expected to take on the order of 1 million years. There are a lot of ways in which this is bad, but perhaps the most serious threat that we can expect to see materialize in coming years is that of so-called wet bulb disasters, in which temperature and humidity both get so high as to make the survival of humans a physical impossibility. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future opens with a harrowing depiction of one such event in India. That all sounds pretty bad and like the kind of thing that a well-ordered society would mount an effective response to, but we're at the end of almost 2 years of a global pandemic in which a significant fraction of people refuse to believe in the very existence of a disease that's killing people all around them in the hundreds of thousands. So from all of this, it's completely obvious that the human race is going to have to build carbon capture technologies on an incredibly massive scale. If you think of this in terms of all the coal mines that have been hollowed out of the Earth's crust, all of the petroleum deposits that have been drained, all of the forests and peat bogs that have been burned, basically we have to fill those back up again with stable carbon-containing compounds that we'll have to manufacture. We'll need to do it fast. It'll be by far the largest engineering project in the history of the world. I believe that we will do it, and that 100 years from now, this problem will have been solved. Atmospheric CO2 levels will be back to where they were before the Industrial Revolution. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's going to take decades, and during that time, we're going to begin seeing disastrous events such as the one depicted in the Ministry for the Future. On those rare occasions when people talk about solar geoengineering at all, it's conventional to describe it as an idea that's on the extreme fringe and that deserves to be there because it seems so dangerous. Much more research is needed, is the usual conclusion. I do wonder whether it will continue to seem all that dangerous a decade or two down the road when climate disasters are leading directly to mass fatalities, particularly given the fact that nature has already performed the experiment for us on several occasions, and we know that the sulfates naturally wash out of the atmosphere in a couple of years. Danger is always relative. Jumping out of a moving car is dangerous, but people will do it anyway if the car is about to go over a cliff. So in my book, Termination Shock, an individual billionaire constructs a large gun that shoots sulfur into the stratosphere, simulating what volcanoes do. This is already a fait accompli at the beginning of the story, and so what it's mostly about is how people react to it. Needless to say, not everyone is happy. Just to give some sense of scale, the amount of sulfur that this fictional gun is capable of launching over the course of a year's continuous operation is only about 1% of what Mount Pinatubo put into the air explosively. But in his mind, it's just a pilot project, and the plan is to build more such facilities in other parts of the world. And that is the setup for a kind of geopolitical thriller that is essentially the story of those who are happy about this plan and those who are extremely unhappy. So we're going to turn it over now to a conversation with Xander and some Q&A. But before we do, I just wanted to flash up the URL for ComancheEagle.org. How this is relevant to Termination Shock won't be obvious until you get deeper into the book. They have not endorsed my book in any way, so I'm not claiming that, but I'm endorsing them as a remarkable organization that's doing important work, not just in preservation of raptors, but also in curating many other records and artifacts of the Comanche tribe. They don't like to call them artifacts. They say life objects. This is an older Flash website, but if you skip the intro, you'll be taken to this page with its all-important donate button on the right, ComancheEagle.org. So as soon as you're all done contributing to the Long Now Foundation, if you've got any pocket change left, this is the kind of organization where a little would go a long way. So with that, I think we can shut the projector down and go to the Q&A mode. Thanks.
Thank you. There's going to be some people walking around with cards, if you don't already have one. And Stuart Brand has volunteered to sort them for us, and we'll be sending them up here on stage. Thank you. I think the setup of a rogue billionaire doing geoengineering is, how likely do you think it is that a person will do it versus a government?
I think
just a fun way to do the story, or?
It's a fun way to do the story. Yeah, I think I have to do some work in the story explaining how this guy is able to get away with it. But having it be an individual makes for kind of better storytelling. Realistically, I think it would be a pretty hard caper to pull off. So what I kind of think is more realistic is that at some point, especially if we start seeing these wet bulb events or other mass casualty disasters, that some government somewhere is going to run the numbers on this and say, you know, we don't care what anyone thinks of us. This is going to be a good deal for our country, and so we're going to go ahead and do it.
And we've had David Keith here, who's been doing some of the early kind of numbers on this, as well as Kelly Windsor, who may be in the audience here. Who's actually working on getting this research really done. It's interesting. I think that you're right that at the conclusion of all these conversations, people say we need to do more research,
yeah,
but they're not really doing it.
Well, not only that, but a lot of times when people do try to start research programs, they get shot down because even doing research is viewed as being beyond the pale.
Yeah, even when David Keith spoke here, we had about 20 people here thinking that he was doing the aerosols in the atmosphere, you know, for brain control and that whole thing. So it quickly goes sideways.
They're getting it, and they're in a crossfire from environmentalists on the left and from people on the right who think it's all associated with chemtrails. Yeah. So.
And how did you get going down this path? What was their impetus for starting down this?
I had been kind of tracking it for a while, and you know, it's kind of an inherently interesting science fictional topic. You know, the notion of volcanoes having these huge effects on human destiny, and particularly what a mystery it was to like the Romans. I mean, they had no way of knowing that a big volcano had blown up in El Salvador, right? So to them, there's just something happens.
Act of God.
Yeah. So there's that, and then I've brushed up against a few people looking at sort of cloud brightening and other space-based solar geoengineering, which means putting stuff at L1 between the Earth and Sun to block some of the sun's light. So it's an idea that's been in the air, for a little while. And I just kind of reached a point in 2019 where I thought, you know, if not now, when? I'm supposed to be a guy who writes books about technical subjects, and why haven't I tackled this one yet?
It's interesting you were able to kind of cross-correlate some data from the Long Now property, these bristle cones. In fact, this is the core of that tree that he was referencing in that slide. It's 1,000 years of bristle cone right there. And when we're designing the clock to last for 10,000 years, one of the things the clock does is synchronizes itself to solar noon on a sunny day. And so then my question became, how many not sunny days or years might we have over the course of 10,000 years?
Right.
And
if there was a Laki or a Tambora, or worse.
Yeah. So we don't get a synchronization event. So that became that. It was interesting that we had a property with these bristle cones, and we asked those scientists this question, say, how many years over 5,000 or 10,000 would we have to deal with making the clock be accurate for? But it's interesting how this data kind of keeps coming back as this very useful thing. And strangely, we bought a property in Eastern Nevada that has these trees on it. But the other side of the data that they're correlating is the ice core data. So I think that shows how much
that's where they get the
particulate,
right? The aerosols, yeah, which is both ash. I assume it's mostly ash, and so like a detail in all this is that these volcanoes produce ash, which is not ash; it's just powdered aerosolized lava. So that's a kind of dusty stuff that's typically in the lower atmosphere, but then the sulfates are up high, and they can have countervailing effects. So an ash blanket can make things warmer, sulfates can make things cooler. And that's one reason why the correlations aren't always super obvious.
And so if we use one of these technologies to potentially shade the planet, there's still other effects of things like the CO2 precipitating into the oceans, and it's just kind of a stopgap.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone who studies this at all will admit that right off the bat, that the real problem is the CO2, and even if the warming effects of CO2 could be counteracted through some intervention like this, you'd still have ocean acidification and other nasty byproducts of too much CO2 in the atmosphere. So the only way to think about this is as like applying a tourniquet while the patient is transported to the hospital.
And there's also, there's a lot of ways to do geoengineering. You chose this one because it was interesting.
It's simple, and the guy who's doing it is a Texas oil billionaire. His background is in the oil and mining industry, and if you've ever dealt with people like that, it's a simple is good. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's build a thing. So to me, it just seemed like the kind of solution that would appeal to that kind of person. And also, it's just the most dead simple way of doing this kind of intervention. And so I thought that would make it seem a little more immediate, as opposed to positing some hyper advanced thing that hasn't been invented yet.
And you've changed your writing styles over the years, going back all the way to first there was the command line essay, and then with your Baroque cycle. Or have you found a thing that you're now doing, or you continue to do it, changing it for different books?
It's always a little different. I think there's kind of a one way of writing things when it's a kind of contemporary action, thriller type of book like Ream D or Termination Shock, and then different styles simply dovetail with different kinds of books. I had a lot of fun sort of copying the sort of the 17th century English writing style in the Baroque cycle, because it's bombastic and they capitalize letters at random, and they italicize things, and it's just kind of hilarious to read.
and also your methodologies, right? I think you started handwriting back at the Baroque cycle. Is that still something you're doing?
Yeah, I'm still doing that. there have been a couple books since then where that got started on a word processor, and so I just kept doing them that way. But for the most part, I do all original composition with fountain pen on paper.
So this whole book was written.
Yeah,
big steps.
yeah. I realized before I just came on stage here that I had forgotten to post my picture of the stack, which is about that high for the manuscript for this book.
And I mean, the other thing that you do, and we cross over a little bit around both your daughter and I build battle bots, and you've worked on it, but you are a constant builder of physical things. What kind of physical projects are you working on these days?
Well, my kind of thing-making energies for a while were being absorbed by some work that we were doing at Magic Leap to make content for augmented reality, which is not a physical building. Well, it turned into a physical building thing project. I have a way of doing that, but that stopped a year and a half ago, and so during lockdown, I started just killing time by building stuff, and I made some robot parts, and then about a year ago, I acquired a vertical machining center, and Rusty Oliver Hazard Factory in Seattle was kind enough to clear some space for it. So now I have a vertical machining center. And then a couple of months ago, I got an engine lathe, or antique, not antique, but a sort of vintage Italian lathe. So Graziano SAG 17. And
the usual gateway drugs for
exactly. So we're kind of tooling up, and then that draws people in, who have projects they want to build and work on. So, just within the last couple of weeks, I've connected up with someone, a techie in the Seattle area who has suddenly become interested in carbon capture. So I let him know that I can turn his drawings into atoms, if it comes to that.
You're going to start building some carbon capture machines?
On a very small scale, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah. But you got to start somewhere.
Well, and you mentioned Magic Leap, and I'm sure this is a slightly painful subject at this point, but with the advent of Meta and all that, and where you started with this, but do you have some thoughts as to the way this is coming back at you?
Well, it's very weird. But people have been sort of poking at the idea of the metaverse since the book came out, and have come up with various visions of what it could look like and ways to implement it. But nothing like Facebook changing its name to Meta and announcing that they're now a metaverse company. So we're followed immediately by Microsoft and Disney, two other companies you may have heard of, saying that they too are metaverse companies. Epic is a metaverse company. There's a lot of metaverse companies out there. It doesn't bring me anything except weird, annoying contacts on social media. But and probably sells a few more copies of Snow Crash. So that's not all bad, but
Nice. And one of the other thing that I work with your daughter and your son-in-law on is the clock project. They've been engineers on the project since the beginning. So it's been really great. It's become a family business.
Yeah.
And working with them. So it's been really fun. I think, and on that subject, you actually wrote, and I mentioned it earlier. You sent in one of the earliest clock ideas when I first met you almost 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because I thought it was one of the more fun ideas that we played around with, and in ways we're actually doing some version of it for the clock.
It was during the run up to the turn of the millennium, and I think Long Now wanted to put the clock was still just kind of just getting started, and so to observe the turning over of the odometer at 2000, the idea was to put up at least some visions of what the clock might look like. And so Danny and others asked a few people to just sort of draw up their ideas of what it might look like. And I had been thinking about kind of reading the newspaper every day and getting this constant stream of information. Was it really that important to read it every day, or because at the end of the year they always publish a year-end roundup of the news, right? And then at the end of the decade they published the decade roundup, and at that time they were starting to prepare their end of century and end of millennium news roundups. So the Norman conquest and all these other things, and so it just got me thinking, like, what if you actually structured your life around that, so that you would make a decision that you were only going to get an update of the news once a year, or once every 10 years, or whatever. And so that produced the idea of monastic orders that would kind of take a vow to that effect, and they would live in a set of at the time I drew it as concentric rings with walls and gates that would open under clock power every year, or every 10 years, or every 100 or 1,000 years. And when they were open, you could pass through the gate. You could leave if you wanted, or you could go in deeper, and become an even more isolated person. So that was what I sketched out, and I think it's probably still up on the Long Now site somewhere. And then that became the basis of my novel Anathem, with a lot of elaboration and variation. Well, in the novel, they're no longer concentric. They're kind of just arranged around the property. The concentric thing wasn't going to work because everyone needs access to the clock tower.
Right.
So, yeah.
Interesting intervention into a world that has lots of multi-thousand-year clocks.
Yeah.
Indeed. Do we have some questions? Thank you. All right. Let's see. All right. From Alec V, we have could VR, AR, metaverse be used to simulate the problem and make it feel more real? I'm assuming you mean about climate change and things like that.
I think it could be a great display mechanism you can't really get a grip on what one of these interventions might do until you perform a simulation. And we have got pretty good software now for running climate simulations and seeing how effects are geographically distributed. And that's kind of the basis of the book, because if you look at one of these simulations, you might see a splotch somewhere in India or Africa or America where there would be a severe drought or massive flooding. And so that kind of spatial data is really important in thinking about these problems and these interventions, and AR, VR is a good way to display that stuff. Unfortunately, it would only work on people who already believe in the existence of human-caused climate change, and anyone else would dismiss it out of hand as communist propaganda. So I'm not sure it would help with that part of the problem.
And Peter asks, do you think it's truly inevitable that we're going to deploy some of this kind of solar geoengineering?
I wouldn't say anything's inevitable, but I think it's under discussed right now in our discourse around climate change, because it is sort of a taboo idea, and and so I think it's okay to bring it out into the open and talk about it more, because sooner or later, again, if you read the opening chapter of Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which is typically for him a meticulously researched and carefully drawn account of one of these disasters, it doesn't take more than one or two of those to get a government thinking about some kind of intervention. So I do think that it's going to get talked about and maybe going to get done in some parts of the world that aren't quite so so meticulous about self-censorship.
I mean, I think it's very interesting how that conversation around geoengineering creates so much controversy when fundamentally we are geoengineering the planet and have been now for hundreds of years.
Yep.
But it's kind of one of those things. It's also Revive and Restore has had this issue of, if we've been extincting species for thousands of years, but the moment you are purposeful in bringing one back, they start using this phrase, unintended consequences a lot.
Yeah, we can't have those ferrets coming back. Yeah, yeah. No, it is an odd kind of habit of thought that we've got into, and I know why. It's the precautionary principle, and the precautionary principle is there for good reasons. We screwed a bunch of stuff up, but yeah. One of the great things about Charles Mann's books, 1491, 1493, is the completely nuking the idea that there was such a thing as pristine nature. Even indigenous peoples all over the world were geoengineering their ecosystems and their climate for tens of thousands of years before the first settlers even showed up.
Yeah, so it seems to be fine to do geoengineering haphazardly, but if we do it with intention, then we all of a sudden have to have a big discussion about it. Yeah, Anna Marie is asking. It sounds like you believe that in 100 years we will have successfully sequestered enough carbon, but she's wondering, I think, why do you have so much hope? Is it just because we have to?
Because we have to. Yeah, and I think once it gets rolling and we find processes that'll work, that it'll become a thing that people are excited about and that people want to take part in. And it's a thing that has to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that we have a question here about the fires here, but I think we are starting to do some geoengineering with the extreme level of fires that we're having. And I think one of the more interesting pieces of data that I saw was after 9/11, the 21 days that the planes didn't fly over the United States, that temperature actually rose. So
because the contrails weren't.
Yeah, so there's this interesting other effect that can happen where you can mask the effects of global warming, and actually by taking some things out of the air, you can create a new problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah.
Cool. Let's see. We have Shane asking, what are you reading these days? And do you read fiction or nonfiction for the most part?
I mostly read nonfiction. I mostly read history books. So I did finally, I postponed buying and reading the Mister because I knew it was out there, and I wanted to finish my book first. So that's definitely on my bedside table now. And for, as a guilty pleasure, I read the fantasy novels of Joe Abercrombie. He's got about 9 of those things out now, and they're amazingly good reads. And then a bunch of history. So some of the books that I mentioned, The Fate of Rome, is a particularly amazing book. It basically looks at what happened to Rome through the lens of both climate change and pandemics, and how those two interacted. So the part I didn't read about the 536 eruptions and the cold weather that followed is that cold snap effectively opened a channel by which bubonic plague was able to escape from its reservoir in Central Asian marmot colonies and make it out to the Mediterranean, and led to the Justinian plague, which he gives a spectacular description of. I mean, Yersinia pestis, man, that is one seriously bad actor. And now we don't, we've got antibiotics that can control it. And so we kind of underrate it, but
it was almost 50% of the known population of the world was killed during that time.
Yeah. And in its, when it really gets rolling and it just gets transmitted through the air, people would begin to experience symptoms and be dead within an hour or two. Just unbelievable bad stuff. But it's bottled up in certain areas until the temperature changes in such a way that enables the vectors of it to escape.
Right. Well, we had Jeffrey Mano and Nicola Twillier. They're talking about in their book about the history of pandemics. The thing I didn't know is that passports were actually invented during that time. That they were there to show that you were not going to transmit the disease. It's interesting, ironic now that people are really upset about passports being used in this fashion.
Right.
But that's actually what they were invented
why
for.
They exist.
Was the pandemic.
Yeah. That's great. So that's a great book to read. That Children of Ash and Elm, Totally New History of the Vikings, is another one that I enjoyed very much.
Yes. Well, Leona's asking if you could share more about why you find the Comanche species preservation so important, but I guess I also, without ruining the part of the book about this. So.
Oh, well, I mean, there's some Comanche related content in the book. It's not too much of a spoiler. It happens in West Texas, but the place that I mentioned, ComancheEagle.org, is ostensibly a raptor rescue center. So like a lot of places like that, you go in and you'll see eagles and hawks and so on that have been kept alive, that were shot by a hunter or something. Maybe they can't fly, but they're being fed and kept alive at this place, and they can make new. The parts of them involved in making new eagles still work. So there's that, but these people also are doing a great job of preserving old photos and records, and I'm going to use the word artifacts, like weapons and other items that tell the story of that people, which is a really interesting and unusual group of people. I won't try to go any deeper than that, but even among Native American tribes, they've got a really unusual story.
And Adam is asking what your favorite type of carbon capture or storage technology that you're seeing now is.
The tough part is the scale that it has to work on. So there's some dialogue in the book where the TR is saying that the amount of carbon we have to remove from the atmosphere, if you just turn it into carbon black and made a pile of it, would be the size of Mount Rainier. It would be about 30 cubic miles of solid carbon. And so I remember looking at an idea I thought it was cool a few years ago, and we were researching it and talking about it, and well, maybe we should try this, and then actually bothered to run the numbers and came to grips with the fact that it wasn't big enough. I mean, there's no way. Recently, a friend of mine dropped out of JPL to start a carbon capture company, and his comment was, "We're going to need a lot of fans."
Yeah, somehow you have to filter all of the air
Yeah.
in much of the atmosphere
Yeah.
through this device.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The scale is pretty massive.
Yeah, because it's very dilute. That's the problem. It's all over the world. There you can't. It's not concentrated anywhere. It's perfectly distributed all over the world, and it's not present in high concentrations. It's only 400 and some parts per million. So that's a really hard problem to solve. So I think my favorite technology hasn't even been invented yet, but people are working on it hard.
And I think it's an interesting one, just on the general nature of science fiction here from Anton, is that people often get more intrigued with the kind of the cool new tech than really the way that its socioeconomic and cultural effects will play out. And I think carbon capture is in a way, or geoengineering is kind of one of these things. I mean, what's your take on how you get people to kind of see that side of things and understand the cultural parts?
Specifically with kind of
any new tech, whether it's
yeah,
the metaverse,
right. Well, I mean, with social media stuff, I mean, it's for me, it's all about how are people making money, and if you're using an app that's free and constantly putting data into it, you should be asking yourself some questions. And when you see that the people who make the app are becoming among the wealthiest people and the company's becoming one of the richest companies in the world without charging you any money, so that is I think that probably goes to the point that the questioner is making about think in terms of what is actually going on behind the curtain with some of these applications, and first and foremost, how are people making money from it? There's an old line about the apps on the internet that if you can't figure out what the product is, it's you. So.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions here, I think, with this type of technology, like geoengineering, is how does this become accepted in the world? And I think one of the interesting things, obviously, that science fiction plays this role is a way of playing something out like this so that it can then be kind of more accepted with another generation, whether or not it's our generation. Do you see you've made some efforts in trying to make some large positive versions of science fiction rather than just dystopic? Where do you think your role is, and other science fiction authors' role in kind of playing out positive versus dystopic futures?
Well, I think the important thing is to allow for some ambiguity and not try to go full dystopian or utopian, because readers seeing that will, I think, sense that, oh, hang on a sec, that's not ever how it really is. And so what I've tried to do in the case of Termination Shock is to just show this system being built by this guy as kind of that's the opening. That's takes a while to get to it, but that's essentially already happened at the beginning of the book. And then rather than trying to portray that as a dystopian or a utopian behavior, show how different people respond to it. And so in this book, there are some people from low-lying areas that are threatened by sea level rise who think this is great because this is going to save their country. And there's other people who are afraid that it's going to interrupt the monsoon that their economy and their way of life depends on, and they are not happy about it. So I think that's a fairly realistic depiction of what would happen if somebody began to do this. And I think the best way to cover it in a book is to show that and not try to put one's thumb on the scale.
Indeed. Well, I think you pre-signed all the books for this, so we're sorry that we can't do a signing just but for COVID reasons. The passing of thousands of books through hands is obviously not the right move.
It seemed like the most efficient conceivable scheme to spread a respiratory virus. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But if you didn't already buy a book, there are extra signed ones out front, and I really loved this book. Can you just say a little bit about what you were working on next?
Well, I've got a kind of a next book project on the docket that I need to get going on, but it'll be probably a couple of months before I can get to it. And in the meantime, I'm puttering. I'm gradually sliding into kind of retired old weirdo kind of mode with this, and making stuff that is economically valueless, but at least I don't have to deal with raising money and the usual hassles of working in an organized company. So that takes various forms, and it's hopefully keeping me out of trouble.
And you're just at the beginning of this book tour, yeah? So it's just
yesterday? This is me at my peak, in case you're wondering. Yeah, it's all downhill from here.
Nice. Well, I'm going to let Stuart have the closing question, since he's been gracious enough to do the sorting here. And he's asking, is climate change helping humanity think longer term?
Oh, well, it seems like a great way to incentivize that. It's you can't think about it unless you're thinking long term, because if you're not thinking long term, you're just talking about the weather. And we've all had the conversation with the surly uncle at Thanksgiving dinner saying, it was cold last night. I guess that disproves all of this global warming nonsense. And so we kind of have to. It's I suppose it's a kind of a potentially Darwin Award moment for the whole species in a certain way. Hopefully we don't win the award.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, y'all.